Welcome to our weekly Come Follow Me discussion. This evening, we're going to be covering Doctrine and Covenants, sections 89 through 92. Carl has been great, and turn the time over to Carl.
Thank you. So for tonight, we're going to talk obviously about the word of wisdom. We can't get through these sections without talking about that. We're also going to talk about oracles, apocrypha. I have some selected scriptures that I've identified I'd like to talk about. And then I want to talk lastly about what a lively member means. So let's just chat for a bit about the word of wisdom. I heard an interesting story this week about a gentleman who was on a cruise ship, and the waiter kept trying to insist that he order some sort of alcoholic beverage. And he was saying, no, I don't want to. And then he finally said, it's because of my religion. I don't drink alcohol. And then the cruise ship guy said, well, Jesus drank wine. Finally, he said, no, he had to be almost rude and say, no, I don't want any. And so I would like to ponder the question, why do you keep the word of wisdom?
I can think of a number of reasons.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I can also think of a couple of reasons. I don't know if it's exactly what you're thinking of here, Carl, but I know for me, I keep the word of wisdom because it's an example of modern day revelation that we've been given through our prophets to help guide us in our lives here. So I see that as an example of modern commandments, I guess, that are more applicable to these days.
I mean, I've been taught the word of wisdom probably since I was very young. It's probably because, I've lived it, I've put it to the test, I've tried it, and it works. I've also tried not living it, and I've tried, things that I shouldn't be consuming or partaking of, and they didn't work. And so, I'm not a perfect, there's certainly things I could do better following the word of wisdom.
You're not perfect?
I probably eat way too much sugar and chocolate. And I know that's not specifically in the word of wisdom, but it is something, I could do better in. But it's a way of looking after the health of our bodies. And it's one of the best guides that I've ever found to help me to make those decisions better. And it just works. So I've put it to the test and it works. The second probably big reason is that I wouldn't be able to attend the temple or participate in teaching seminary if I didn't claim when I was asked that I was keeping the word of wisdom. That's also a good reason too.
Good reasons, yeah. Well, the reason I pondered this question and I posed it tonight specifically for this discussion is because there are several different ways of thinking about it. Now, sometimes in the past we've sort of proposed that the reason we do it is for medical reasons. It's a health code. You can get hung up on that because sometimes they'll release some minutia that says, drinking a glass of wine per day is good for your health or whatever. I like what Jesse said about revelation. And I like what you said, Rod, about the temple and covenants. And so is it a health code or is it a holiness code? Well, I just wanted to look at that for a moment. Start off with the recent statement. Well, I say recent, it was 2019 official church statement where the church upgraded some things and said that they included as a prohibition in the word of wisdom, vaping, e-cigarettes, green tea, and coffee-based products. And then they also put some cautions out with respect to marijuana and opioids that are available for medicinal purposes. I had heard about this official church statement, but I didn't actually read it until this week. I don't know, were the rest of you aware of it?
I'm in the same boat. I've heard of it, but I've never actually read it.
But I like the statement that was given years ago in 1979 by President Boyd K. Packer. I've come to know that a fundamental purpose of the word of wisdom has to do with revelation. If someone under the influence can hardly listen to plain talk, how can they respond to spiritual promptings that touch their most delicate feelings? As valuable as the word of wisdom is as a law of health, it may be much more valuable to you spiritually than it is physically. And I just thought, that makes sense to me. That struck a chord for me that how can we expect to listen to the spirit, the still small voice, if we're under the influence of whatever? And so I've tried to live my life in listening, and doing things that would prohibit you from hearing is something that I've tried to shun away with. Now, I'm probably going to get into trouble on this next comment. I might have to edit it. I actually even am very, very careful about how much music I listen to. oftentimes I get into a car with someone and they've got the radio blaring and there's music going in the background. And I think to myself, how can you hear the Spirit if that all that noise is going on?
Yeah, if it's in excess and it's making you feel uncomfortable.
I completely agree. I'll be honest. One of the main reasons I will listen to music is to help me not think of anything,
Right.
give my mind a break.
I was going to say that's why I watch TV.
Yeah. I listened to years ago to a talk, and I can't remember who it was or exactly what the comment was, but he coined the phrase opium for the mind, that a lot of our entertainment today is just that. It releases us from having to think. And I think that can be good, and sometimes it can be not so good.
It gets really easy to just always do that, to let your mind go, not having those hard thoughts. It's not easy to listen to those spiritual promptings or to be prepared for them or to think through these difficult things.
It's like taking a nap. It's if you need to have some rest and relaxation, like taking a short nap, it's good, but don't do that for 5 hours a day. then it's not good. Don't sleep the day away. So yeah, I mean, you can end up watching TV. You can binge watch TV and waste a whole lot of time, which is in excess.
I also heard a speaker this week who related pornography to the word of wisdom, which I thought was kind of an interesting thing, because he says it's the addictive qualities of no matter what it is, even though it may not specifically say anything in the scriptures, it's obviously the same sort of element. Your physical body gets tricked, that you get addicted. And whether that's coffee, tea, or TV, it's the same thing. It doesn't really matter. Then I found another interesting article that I want to show you here. It's about what happened in South Africa when they banned booze. Here it is. In Cape Town, the government tried to control the COVID outbreak by banning booze, but people were still disobeying the rules and going to places to gather socially. And so they just said, that's it, no more booze. And they cut booze off in the whole country. So you couldn't sit in a bar, you couldn't order a glass of wine, you couldn't even buy beer at the store. There was an immediate public health benefit that had nothing to do with COVID. Suddenly, emergency rooms were empty, devoid of alcohol-related accidents.
I hadn't heard this before. That's cool.
That's kind of interesting. So they automatically had more room and more people available to deal with COVID because they weren't dealing with a crowded ER full of half-drunken, bleeding people. And then the article goes on to explain that the ban also exposed the country's complicated and painful history with alcohol. And they go through and they talk about potential changes that might be happening in South Africa. But I just thought, wow, something to be said for that.
I'm thinking more about my first answer, like why I live the word of wisdom. One thing I like to teach the youth when I get a chance in seminary to do this, and that because the word of wisdom is just an example of one of the many revelations or principles that we're either commanded or suggested to follow and keep, but that comes with a promise. And because this one does, the word of wisdom has a wonderful promise tied to it if we keep it. And I guess I just want to make the point here that everybody should put it to the test. We should, try it out and look to see if the promise comes through. Don't just follow it blindly, but, does it work? And for me, it does. And so I guess I just wanted to make that, that point a little stronger.
Section 90. Okay, so what's an oracle? I kind of had a fuzzy idea in my mind, so I went back to my Webster's 1830 dictionary and found out that an oracle among the pagans, people might remember in Greece that they had the Delphi oracle where you could go and ask questions and get answers. But among Christians, oracles in the plural denotes the communications, revelations, or messages delivered by God to prophets. I guess you could replace oracle just with revelations. Nevertheless, through you shall the revelations be given to another, yea, even unto the church. And all they who receive oracles of God or revelations of God, let them beware how they hold them, lest they are counted as a light thing and are brought under condemnation and stumble and fall. Then talks about the storms that will descend and the winds blow and the rains descend and beat upon your house, which is, of course, referring back to the house built on a rock. And I think it's almost the Lord telling us that in the future, things are going to get rough. They're going to get worse. The storms are going to descend. And if you look outside today, the storms are descending. And even in greater and greater quantity, life can become somewhat difficult, and it's good that we have the oracles of God, that we have revelations.
Yeah, those are things that we need to be holding on to and not taking lightly during this time. I certainly agree.
Our style of church meetings is different than many. They're different than most churches. We don't have a paid clergy nor a trained clergy in a sense of the traditional way. And so you can sometimes find yourself in a meeting and thinking, perhaps my time could be better used elsewhere. I'm here to say that that's not the case, that if you've prepared yourself mentally and you're ready for sacrament meeting, whether it be sacrament meeting or even conference, that you can receive revelation despite what is being said from the pulpit. The reason I say that is there's been times in my life where I've been at conference and were some of the senior people in the church, apostles, even a prophet one time who I was listening to, and it wasn't connecting with me. I don't know if you've ever had that experience. I remember later reading a particular talk, which I didn't glean anything from when I was listening live, but the talk itself, when I read it later, was fantastic. And so I had to question to myself, what happened? What was going on in my own personal life at that time that stopped me from seeing what I was able to see later on paper? And then I realized that not everybody delivers a talk the way I would appreciate it. Everybody has different styles, different ways of doing things. I remember reading an article, can't remember who it was a senior apostle who said, some people are called into the quorum of the 12, not because they're good speakers, but because they have other talents that we need. And that's certainly the case when you look at the first presidency that was organized in section 90 here, when Frederick G. Williams is called in. Now, if you contrast Frederick G. Williams with the other counselor, which was Sidney Rigdon, and Sidney Rigdon was this powerful preacher who could keep a crowd mesmerized for 2 hours or more, whereas Frederick G. Williams was a businessman. And you can see that the Lord's brilliance in calling different people as counselors for the prophet, because certainly the church needed that business sense, and they needed the preaching ability, and they needed the oracle, the revelation ability. And so that first presidency was very, very dynamic in its ability to assist the church.
I always, going back to what you were saying about not always getting things out of sacrament meeting, or, people criticizing kind of sometimes the way that we set up our meetings. I know for myself, I've heard from a few people that, they almost scoff at the fact that we have essentially an open mic once a month, during our testimony meetings, where we invite anyone to go up and speak and kind of speak what's on their mind. And anyway, I remember on my mission learning, or kind of having my eyes opened, we were always worried about bringing our investigators to testimony meeting.
Because you never knew what was going to happen.
Because you never knew what was going to happen. And, and I don't want to sound, more than anything, the reason I was like that is because I was so worried about, how people would interpret it. But time after time, I was surprised to find that our investigators would come out of those crazy testimony meetings sometimes, where there were some odd things that were said, but they would come out of that being like, that was amazing. I feel so much better, and things like that. And it really speaks to the idea that, it's really, how prepared are you for the message? And it really does speak to you on an individual basis. So for me, I wasn't as prepared in those times, and I was more worried about what people would say wrong than what was actually being said right and what was being felt. And so it really is to those individuals that I've heard this criticism from more recently, that, this is an open mic. It's like, I really just feel bad for them, because you can tell that their mind is more focused on, they're looking for the negative.
Sometimes we get in the way of the Spirit, where we get all worried about what's being said, and we just need to let the Spirit work its miracle and to touch people. The church that we belong to has raised the bar. You're required in our church to be at a higher level. The expectation is that you'll come prepared, that you'll come ready to receive revelation, ready to contribute. Whereas in other churches, I'm not trying to degrade any other church, but I'm just saying that oftentimes you go there to say, okay, entertain me. And so you can see how it's a little different here. If you're not getting something out of the meeting, then the first thing you have to do for myself is I have to look at myself. I wasn't prepared today. I didn't come prepared, or my mind is distracted, or I'm thinking outside of what I should be. It's Sunday. I should be concentrating more on spiritual things and less on the worldly things that sometimes get us trapped. Another interesting comment here was from George Q. Cannon. We have the Bible, the Book of Mormon, the Book of Doctrine and Covenants, but all these books, without the living oracles and constant stream of revelation from the Lord, would not lead any people into the celestial kingdom. And that's true of our sacrament meetings too. Not from the point that it's going to give us doctrine, but from the point of it helps us to knock off a few of those rough edges that we have.
The one thing that I really like when I get together with the ward, and that you don't get to do in stake or general conference, or in just studying the Bible yourself, or the Book of Mormon yourself, is we get to come together, and this will take place in fast testimony meetings or sacrament meeting talks, but particularly in Sunday school and elder quorum meetings and release society meetings, is that we don't just talk about the doctrine, but we get to discuss how we're applying these principles and how, it's worked for me or didn't work for me, and it's worked for you, and how are you doing? So we get to share with one another and lift one another that way, because that is the challenge. I mean, we can read and we can study it, but it's living it is the challenge. So as we work together and as we discuss together our trial and errors and our wins and our failures, and I mean, that to me is really what's valuable. Doesn't always happen, but when it happens, that's what I like to go to church meetings for, and to hear other people's experiences.
That's where it gets real. Yeah, it's not theoretical anymore. This is what happens in my house.
Or this is what I've tried that worked, and this is what I tried didn't work. So
yeah, this is where the rubber hits the road, and where you can say, okay, some practical applications. And I love that too. That's wonderful.
And we can receive personal revelations coming away from those kind of meetings, like, okay, this is what I'm going to try tomorrow to improve.
As I said, it's not passive. It's a more active church than most people realize.
Well, you were talking about the professional ministers in other denominations. I mean, it is very different. They're trained, they're paid, their living is to develop wonderful, entertaining, thought-provoking sermons, engaging sermons. But I've always wondered about, the whole, the whole Catholic approach, where how can a single priest who's never been married help us poor guys that are trying to figure out how to be married much? Because, or how to be parents. I want to hear from those grandparents that have figured this all out.
Some high priest who's sitting in the back, who's 90 years old, who actually went through life and experienced a bunch of stuff. I want to talk a little bit about the Apocrypha. I know I'm being a nerd, but it is what I am. So the Apocrypha is from the Greek and the Latin as well, which means secret or hidden. And it generally talks about the books that were available in the intertestament time, between what we call the New Testament and the Old Testament. They're 400 lost years, I'll call them, where we don't really have a lot of scripture. There does exist some scripture, but it's not included in the canon of many churches. The Catholic Church does include some additional stuff in canon there, but we do not. They are the subject of a revelation recorded in Doctrine and Covenants section 91, in which it is stated that the contents are mostly correct, but with many interpolations of men. But just so that people know and are aware that there is this series of Apocrypha that is available. And if you'd like to do a little bit of a dive, they're there. So I thought I'd give a little history on a couple of them. One of them is Susanna. This is actually what the Catholics call Daniel 13. Our Daniel ends at 12, but they have Daniel 13, which is this story of this very virtuous woman who is almost blackmailed or framed by two elders of the church, two senior people in the Jewish church, who have unchaste thoughts, let's go with that, towards her. And they're trying to frame her, and they get her into a difficult predicament where she has to choose between two evils, of which she doesn't want to choose. And she chooses not to accept either one of them, and she's condemned to death because of it. And then a young Daniel stands up and says, wait a minute, you haven't really looked at this carefully. And then he takes them almost like a detective, separates these two men and questions them. And of course, they come back with different answers and they're thus able to determine that they're lying and that in fact Susanna has not committed these acts that they portray that she did, trying to force her to. She won't succumb. So it's a very interesting story. I mean, there's not a lot of doctrine in there, but it's an interesting story. And then there's another one, which the Catholics call Daniel 14, which is about Daniel, the god Bel, which in Canaan was called Baal, and about a living god, which was a dragon at the time. The king is asking Daniel to worship this statue of Bel and also then to worship the dragon. Daniel is able to demonstrate to him that the statue is not real and that people are actually eating the things that they're offering to the statue. The king offers the dragon as a living being, and then Daniel is able to actually destroy the dragon. And then everybody then determines that the God of Daniel is in fact the God of all gods. And the people that were trying to destroy Daniel are then ultimately destroyed. So some interesting things. If you want to go into those types of readings, you can. I'm not sure, were you gentlemen aware of the Apocrypha or some of the stories that are available?
I wasn't, no.
I'd sort of heard about it, and I remember, well, I certainly remember the revelation. Joseph Smith was told not to include it in his Joseph Smith translation, but I've never really paid a lot of attention to it. And actually, I was going to ask you, Carl, so like, where did these come from, or did they just sort of come from the same place that the Old Testament came from, just sort of books that were preserved over time?
Much of it is from the oral side. What occurred is somebody wrote them down centuries later. And then so they're not canonized because they're not authorized in a sense of the other scriptures that have a more of a depth, more of a history, something that you can correlate with. But there are some other books. They're the Book of the Maccabees, which are very historic, which are included in this Apocrypha. And they really outline some of the history that went on in this intertestament period. And I've studied them a little bit more than I had these other more fable-like stories. And the history in it is very fascinating, at least for me. And of course, I'm a history nerd too, so that.
Because I was asked if these came from the Dead Sea Scrolls, but that's something totally different, right?
No, the Dead Sea Scrolls are different, but the Dead Sea Scrolls are also considered Apocrypha to a certain extent.
Oh, okay. So that's maybe where the confusion is. Okay.
Yeah, so they're kind of lumped together, but there are actually 14 books that are in some other church Old and New Testaments that we don't include in the King James Version today. They were anciently, not even anciently, even 200 years ago, because the book that Joseph Smith had, that he was doing the revised edition, or what we call the GSD, included those 14 books, which is why he asked those particular questions that were outlined.
It's interesting that he asked about him, though. It's not like he asked, well, should I translate, the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament? So because the Apocrypha, my understanding is the Apocrypha does kind of stand as like alone, like it stands aside.
It is aside, yeah.
It doesn't show up even in the book Bible he had as a part of the Old Testament or the New Testament. It's
no, like it was a separate category.
It's like an appendix or something. So
yeah, it shows up in between the two, the Old and the New Testament. It's interesting as well, because I heard a talk this week where someone was saying, well, the Lord basically said it's mostly good, but there's some stuff in there that man has thrown in. And then he related that to our entertainment that we're watching today, which is mostly good, but has worldly stuff thrown in. And he said we can consider some of the entertainment that's available today, much like the Apocrypha, and that we need to be a little bit careful about what we ingest. So I thought that was a nice takeaway.
Like the word of wisdom.
Like the word of wisdom. I want to talk a little bit more about section 90, in particular, this verse 11 that talks about every man shall hear the fullness of the gospel in his own tongue. I don't know if you realize this, but there are over 7,000 spoken languages in the world today. And the Book of Mormon is only available in 142 languages. 50% of those 7,000 languages, there's no ability to write them. And then a significant portion of those 3,500, or half of the 7,000 spoken languages, are very localized. And a significant portion of those people who speak those languages that are not available to be written are illiterate anyway. And the church has started a program. I don't know if you're aware of it. This was just up on the church website. So that's why I'm bringing it up. And I want to show you a little video clip of about 2 minutes.
I un tiempo de
There are roughly 7,000 languages spoken in the world today. Of these thousands, only 112 have a Book of Mormon translation. It is a unique challenge to bring the Book of Mormon to every nation, kindred, and tongue. Especially challenging is the fact that at least half of the world's languages are strictly spoken, with little or no written counterpart. Even if the Book of Mormon was translated into all written languages, there exist large populations of minority and indigenous peoples who cannot read. This is the case with an indigenous group of people in the Mexican state of Chiapas. The Celtal and Tzotzil people of Chiapas are direct descendants of the ancient Maya. They number hundreds of thousands of individuals living in an area known as Los Altos. They live as they have for hundreds of years through subsistence farming and what they can make with their hands. Their lives are simple. They are deeply connected to their lands and to their heritage. Their faith is astounding, and their childlike humility and belief in God remarkable. The Celtal and Tzotzil indigenous have been joining the church in large numbers ever since missionaries have been sent to bring them the gospel. Missionaries speak in Spanish, and bilingual natives translate for those who only speak their native tongues. It's a challenging work, but when they hear the word of the Lord, the Spirit touches them. In Tzotzil, they have been blessed with a partial translation of the Book of Mormon. However, the challenge remains that a large number of native speakers cannot read. In Celtal, there is currently no Book of Mormon translation, nor any translated church materials. In 2020, a project was begun to translate the newly released Book of Mormon videos from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints into the Celtal language. The goal? To bring the Book of Mormon to a tongue that is almost exclusively spoken. This is the first time in their lives that these members are hearing scripture from the Book of Mormon in their own language. For some, it is the first time that they are even understanding what the Book of Mormon is. This is the story of how this was accomplished and of the impact it has had in the lives of the Celtal people.
Very cool.
Yeah, I felt the Spirit very strongly when I was watching it. You can watch the rest of the video. You can pull it up. I provided the YouTube link there. It's shocking to me almost how we don't realize that we have so much, that the Lord has given us so much. And where much is given, much is expected, much is required. So many people on the earth don't even have the ability to read, let alone have access to the restored gospel of Jesus Christ, and we have it all. Sometimes I think we're underappreciating what we have, and we're ungrateful for what we have literally at our fingertips. I found this next section very interesting, where in section 90, where the Lord is giving kind of instructions to the new first presidency, or what then would be called the first presidency. They're just about finishing the translation of the Bible. And then the Lord kind of gives them instructions of what they want to do. You'll see very, very closely here that the Lord is telling them that they need to set in order the churches. They need to study and learn and become acquainted with all good books and with languages and tongues and people, so that they can govern properly. Even the prophet has to continue to study. Even when you get to be the prophet, you can't stop. I remember a story that Elder Eyring was talking about with President Hinckley, that he would come into the office and President Hinckley would already be there, because he started his day by reading 7 newspapers so that he could stay current with what was happening in the world, so that he could understand what it was that the Lord wanted him to do. So I know that we talked a lot about that last week, but even the first presidency is specifically counseled to continue our study. I talked to an individual this week who said, I'm not in school anymore. I don't want to study anymore. I've said, I'm sorry, boys and girls, we picked the wrong church then, because the Lord wants us to continue to study and to learn and to get better and to progress and to become more like him. That's something I love about the church. That's something that fuels me, that makes me want to continue to study and to learn. And which is why I'm so interested in history and languages and in teaching, because to be honest, the reason that I like to teach is because the teacher is the one who learns the most, because you have to be prepared for whatever comes up. I have this hunger to learn more and more. And I love that about the church, that it wants us to do that, that it encourages us to do that.
Well, I just wanted to add, I certainly agree. Like when I have callings to be a teacher, then I do a lot more studying and I learn a lot more. It's too easy when you're in other callings to not
Let it slide.
let it
Yeah.
slide.
I want to talk about this scripture in section 92. And in particular, when it talks about, he says, I say unto you, my servant Frederick G., you shall be a lively member in this order. It's talking about because he's called into the first presidency, he's part of the United Order that handles the printing and the physical side of the church. I want to know what you think about this term lively member. What does that mean? I was concerned about the term lively and perhaps it had a different meaning. And so I went to my 1830 Webster's Dictionary to look up what lively means. Brisk, vigorous, vivacious, active, as in a lively youth. Or number 5, strong, energetic.
Well, active is there. We often use that, an active, fully engaged. That's what I think it means.
This brings me back to my mission in Mexico. We had a term for those missionaries that were getting ready to go home a little too early. They were dead, to be translated. They were dead missionaries. And so I think of it as the opposite of that. So those dead missionaries, like they did not want to work. They were lazy. They didn't get up on time. They didn't follow the rules, things like that. They were just slowing down and things like that. Whereas the more lively missionaries would be more kind of on the upward rise, right? They were improving every day. They were growing. They were working hard. They were, being diligent and faithful. So that's kind of what that would mean to me, I think.
Anyway, I enjoyed this study this week. I thoroughly enjoyed the deep dives that I was able to do. And I would encourage everybody to continue in this week and looking at those sections 89 through 92. There is so much here. We could spend so much time on it.